Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with your hosts Sydney Timmins and Becky Lawrence. We would like to take this opportunity to let you know that we will be covering a diverse range of mental health topics that may be distressing to some listeners. You can find a full list of the topics being covered in each episode in the show notes. Please check the show notes before listening to any of our episodes. Welcome to the very first episode of the Mental Health Book Club podcast with your hosts Sydney Timmins and
Becky Lawrence.
I thought it would be a good idea to have an introduction podcast so that you can get to know your host better and for us to explain why the Mental Health Book Club podcast is so important to us. So Becky, tell us about yourself.
Okay, so I am a teacher. I teach in a secondary educational setting. I teach history and religious education. Mental health is important to me. I've struggled in the past myself at times, but also because I deal with children's mental health at school on a daily basis in my pastoral role.
So what ages, just for people that aren't familiar with secondary school education, do you teach?
So from the age of 11 to 18.
Oh, okay. So you've got quite a broad range, and it's kids that are generally getting their footing into their adulthood life. So
yes, a lot of hormones and a lot of changes in their body, as well as in their mental health.
Brilliant. So what kind of mental health issues have you suffered? You said that you had some in the past.
Yeah, I've had depression before. I didn't have the best childhood, so I have dealt with issues in my adulthood that reflect my childhood. Things where I dealt with situations in a different way, or I have issues with feeling anger towards people because I was told to suppress that as a child.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for sharing with us. So my name is Sydney Timmins. I'm going to be probably quite frank about the issues I've had with mental health. So I have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is something that affects me on a day-to-day basis. My moods can fluctuate quite dramatically. I can go from being happy to angry in the blink of a second, and when I get to the point where I'm angry, that anger can linger for quite some time, to the detriment probably of everyone around me plus myself. I thought also, along with this podcast, I would discuss the additional issues that I face, which is some issues with depression, anxiety, which have all been diagnosed. Also, I do have a chronic health condition, so I have relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which doesn't necessarily help my mental health at times, but I want to be as open as I can.
Thank you. I think that's really nice to hear. I think a lot of people find the stigmas around mental health mean they don't talk about these things, which is one of the reasons we both want to do this, is to get the conversation going about different mental health illnesses. And I know that we're going to be looking at some books that involve the mental health conditions you have suffered with, but also other mental health conditions, things like I'm interested in anxiety. I see a lot of that at school, and autism. I trained as just training as a special needs coordinator in a school as well, so it does mean that, you know, I look at more the children's side of things, but I know that you have more interest in maybe the adult side of things.
That's true. So I think with both of our perspectives, it will be an interesting mix. If you hear some noise in the background, that is Becky's bunny rabbit having a bit of a scratch around. So I do apologise for that. He all of a sudden decided that he's now awake. Don't you just love animals? Anyway, I also thought that would be interesting just to have a few statistics associated with mental health, just so that we could discuss it before we actually get into the main podcast.
Yeah.
So I went and did some research, because I like to do research. I have a background in higher education, so that's one of my, probably, I would hope, strengths.
She's actually a doctor as well.
Yeah, all right. Anyway, the statistics that I pulled off, and I just thought I would mention these to you to see what you thought about the things that I found out, and some of it did surprise me. So in 2014, the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey released some statistics saying that every week 1 in 6 adults experience symptoms of a common mental health problem such as anxiety or depression. What did you think of that one?
How many? 1 in
6.
1 in 6. See, that seems really high to me, but then I understand that, you know, we all go through challenges in our lives, and I try and push myself out of my limits, which then does cause things like anxiety. So I can understand on a daily basis how some people might feel anxiety on a regular basis, especially when you think of mothers and children and things like that as well.
Daily life, really.
Yeah, daily life.
Cool. The next statistic that I printed off was 1 in 5 adults has considered taking their own life at some point.
1 in 5.
It's incredible, isn't it? I have to admit at this point, I have considered it. I have even tried to take my own life. So for me, this is something that is probably closer to my own well-being than to some others. But I did think 1 in 5 was huge.
Did it make you feel that you're not alone, though?
I think so. It kind of gave me, a little kind of reassurance that if I did or have been feeling suicidal, it's not just me, there are other people out there. Not saying that it's a great thing to feel, but...
Yeah, but not feeling alone is, I think, a really important part of coping with a mental health issue, because you often do feel isolated and alone because of the feelings you're having. And actually, some of these statistics, I think, help us to realise that it's much more of an everyday thing. It's more common than people realise. And I think if we can understand that, then we can help each other through it as well.
Definitely. The next one I thought was really interesting and very sad at the same time is that nearly half of adults believe that in their lifetime they have had a diagnosable mental health problem, yet only a third have received a diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, I know that I see a counsellor on a bi-weekly basis, and my doctor doesn't know about that. That was done privately. So I suppose I can understand that a lot of people might get help privately rather than go through the diagnosis system, as well as I think sometimes it might not be specifically diagnosable as to what the issue might not have a name, for example, but might be suffering. I mean, I've had anxiety. You might say that it's depression, but how do you classify, some of the things as a group, if that makes sense?
I know that from my own experience with borderline personality disorder, it's not one of the typical mental health complaints that people suffer with, and it did take some time for them to recognise what actually was happening for me. Also, I happen to have been diagnosed in a different country, so I was in Australia when I was diagnosed. But when I came back to the UK, I went to my GP and said that I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And my GP's response was to say, well, that's a bit strange, which made me feel so fantastic about myself.
Yeah, I think that shows that even professionals in the field need more education so that they can deal with things better, because actually, that doctor should have been saying supportive things, not something that actually made you feel dismissed, made you feel strange, made you feel, isolated again, like we were talking about before, And so I definitely think that, yes, it might not be a disorder that's often diagnosed, but I think partly that's because here in the UK they don't necessarily recognise it as much as they should. And like you said, it's harder to diagnose because mental health in this country just doesn't seem... The provision is so tapped for money and so overloaded that it's, unless you're actually suicidal, it's hard to actually get any help. Again, one of the reasons I went privately, because I knew I would only get a counsellor rather than a psychologist through the NHS. And whereas I needed something deeper, I needed something that was looking at helping me with my past. And I know that with working with children, often trying to get children to see somebody and get proper help is so difficult. The criteria to get a CAMHS appointment is pretty much you have to be suicidal, which
that's ridiculous.
And it means that they're actually creating more problems for themselves, because that then takes longer to then deal with. Whereas if they actually provided help at an earlier stage, then they wouldn't have to deal with things in such a big way at the end. And I think, things like nipping it in the bud. I know that sounds like it's very dismissive, but that, I do think that a lot of issues could be dealt with earlier.
Yeah, me too. I've got some information about that I'll discuss with you later that I found out about what we really potentially should be doing with mental health provision in the UK. But my next statistic, which I thought was quite positive considering mental health recently has been much more prevalent in the media and people are much more willing to talk about their mental health, including people such as the royal family with their recent campaign. there has been an increase in people accessing mental health. And I do think this is because of the amount of people that are now speaking about their mental health and the reduction in stigma associated with mental health. I do have a bit that I was going to talk about later with you about the stigma surrounding mental health. But what do you think of this finding that people are actually accessing mental health provisions?
I think that's really positive. I think it shows that they're talking about it's working, and getting people to discuss it is becoming, more prevalent. And I do think the media has helped in the coverage of the Royals, support of mental health charities, but also celebrities that have come out and said they've had issues with mental health and that they've battled with it, and success stories, and people that say they continue to battle with it as well. Because, yes, a lot of mental health issues could be put to bed and maybe and watched for, whereas other people, so like yourself, will be suffering, for the rest of their life. It just depends on the level that they're being affected by it.
Definitely. I also think there's a discrepancy between people speaking about it and then the ability, particularly in the UK, to access the help that they need. So more people are saying, hey, I need help, but whether there is the provision of health services to meet those needs is questionable. And again, I've got some more information about that later on.
Yeah, I don't think there is. And, I do think the lack of funding, unfortunately, the government needs to cut money. And so it's the welfare of people that is being cut.
Yeah, definitely. So another statistic, there is a widening gap between the mental health of young women and young men. So young women between the ages of 16 and 24 are almost 3 times as likely to experience a common mental health problem as their male counterparts. So for young women, it's 26% of young women have some common mental health problem in comparison to 9% of men. What do you think of that one?
That surprises me, because a lot of the stuff in the media has been about how men suffer with mental health issues, and it's not discussed as much. And I know, suicide is one of the biggest killers of young men. So it surprised me that women actually are suffering with it more in those years. Maybe because it includes things like postnatal depression, maybe.
Potentially. I mean, maybe with men, they hide their mental health, and that 9% could just be the people that recorded as having committed suicide as potential. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. But I mean, I have heard recently of somebody that my dad knows, their son unfortunately committed suicide, and he was a young gentleman, which is so sad. I just can't get over it.
And often when you hear those stories, people say they had no idea it was coming and that, whereas often women are more likely, I think, to discuss mental health issues because there isn't that stigma of being manly, there isn't that stigma of, the stiff upper lip, get on with it, that men do have. And although there's a lot of change in that, so maybe that's why more men are coming forward, but at the same time there's still a lot of stigma. So yeah, maybe that statistic doesn't actually represent the true number of people suffering for men.
Yeah, exactly. The next one is that this particular age group, so the 16 to 24 year olds, have higher rates of self-harm, bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder.
The post-traumatic stress disorder does surprise me. I mean, the students I deal with, I up to 18, so we do have a lot of students that suffer with anxiety and depression, the stresses of exams and the pressure that is put on young people to know what they want to do and get into universities and things like that is extremely high. So we do see a lot of anxiety and self-harming in schools. Bipolar I've not come across, but it's a PSD that actually surprised me more.
Yeah, me too. I don't know how, for example, active duty in military services has contributed to the increase in PTSD among people aged 16 to 24. It could be the issue for that particular statistic. I'm not sure. The next statistic: people in midlife, so ages 55 to 64, have a noticeable increase in the prevalence of common mental health problems for both men and women.
Well, I suppose they're coming towards retirement and things like that, and
life is changing for them.
Yeah, I think as well, families, their children will be setting themselves up on their own, so they'll be on more alone, actually to suddenly realise that it's just them and their wife or husband again, so they've got to get to know them. So I suppose I can see why there'll be different pressures at that age to cause that to happen.
Definitely. The next one, There are worrying levels of poor mental health among people receiving employment and support allowance. 2/3 report common mental health problems, and the same percentage report suicidal thoughts, with 43.2% having made a suicide attempt. 1/3, so 33.5%, are self-harming. Around 1 in 10 children experiencing mental health problems, and 450 million people worldwide have a mental health problem. I found that quite scary in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that people on unemployment are suffering with mental health issues. The stress of not having a job and having to pay bills and support a family and things like that can really weigh on somebody. Plus, the going for a job and being turned down repeatedly is going to have an effect on your self-esteem and your self-confidence. So I can see why people on unemployment would actually suffer with mental health issues.
Also, potentially the need for them to go to places like food banks because they can't provide for their families, how that would impact your own self-esteem. There's quite a lot of things. But the one thing that I was really shocked by was that around 1 in 10 children experiencing mental health problems, and obviously you're more on the front line than I am, do you have to deal with this on a daily basis, being in a school setting?
I do, especially as a pastoral lead. So my job as a pastoral lead is to look after about 200 students and care for their well-being as well as their day-to-day education. So part of that is that I do have students that self-harm and they come to me and speak to me about it. As a teacher, I've gone to A&E with a student because they self-harmed in school and they needed stitches. It was that bad. That we have students taking the blades out of sharpeners to do this in school. In classes even, which is particularly scary, and we have to put a lot in place, risk assessments and trying to help these students and get them help, and it is hard to find the help out there. And as a teacher, I think I'm expected to be able to counsel students when actually as a professional I'm not trained to do so.
That's incredible. Wow. I don't know really what to say to that.
Yeah, it's very sad. I mean, I think it is hard to be a kid in this day and age and in an adolescence when you have phones and all the social media is one of the biggest issues I think with mental health in young people, partly because when we were younger, if you were bullied at school, which I was, when you got home, they weren't there and you could get away from them. But because of social media, you now also have them there all the time because you've got them on your phone, and I think that has raised a lot of mental health issues because it's unescapable.
Yeah, that's sad, isn't it, that mental health is being impacted by things that we now take for granted, such as the social media presence. So the next thing that I've got written down here in front of me is that Mental Health Foundation's research and programme work is the belief that many mental health problems are preventable. So kind of coming back to what you said earlier, the nipping it in the bud.
Yeah.
There is far more scope for interventions that reduce the incidence of people developing mental health problems and also support recovery, which at the moment, as we've discussed, is particularly difficult with the lack of mental health provision in the NHS. So are we now starting to make the problem worse because we are not necessarily preventing the mental health problems, but we go in and kind of firefight? So once it's got to an extreme, that's when there are interventions put in place.
I think yes, I think the NHS is more reactive because it's got to a state where it has to be. So it's more reactive than preventative. And unfortunately, I think it would be a shame that we can't prevent a lot more of these. I try and encourage students to approach counselling charities so they're able to try and get some kind of help before they get to a point where they feel suicidal or they feel they want to self-harm.
It is just kind of sad. Like, I didn't realise all of the statistics that I found, just how lacking. I know that from my own personal experience that there has been issues with accessing mental health, but you kind of think that maybe it's just you, and in reality it seems that it's not just me, it's everyone is having issues. We're telling people but no one's listening.
Yeah, I agree.
So the next thing that I've got, which also made me really sad about the situation with mental health, that there is an inequality in mental health treatment. So people who are white, British, female or in midlife are more likely to receive treatment. In contrast, people in black ethnic groups have particularly low treatment rates. people with low incomes are more likely to have requested but not received mental health treatment.
Well, I think definitely for the money side of things. I mean, I know I pay privately for a counsellor, and I have to budget for that to be able to afford it. And if I wasn't in the job I'm in, then I wouldn't be able to, and then I wouldn't get the help that I needed. And for you as well, you pay privately because you couldn't get the treatment that was recommended for your condition in the UK on the NHS. They just don't do it.
No, exactly. So for those of you that don't know much about borderline personality disorder, the first line treatment is dialectical behaviour therapy. So this is a therapy that was devised by Marsha Linehan, who is also a sufferer of borderline personality disorder. But this particular treatment program takes a year to complete, and even after that year you're not necessarily cured as such. No. There are still issues that you have to process. And whilst in Australia I was lucky enough to be able to go through a whole year of dialectical behaviour therapy, which includes every single week an hour session with a psychologist, and then a group session which lasted for 2.5 hours, giving you the behavioural tips and tricks about how to deal with life. I think the thing with borderline personality disorder is that there are lots of ways that it could have originated, but for me, I wasn't able to understand emotions. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know how to process them. So you get emotional education, which is kind of saying something that in school this was only touched upon. You also learn how to communicate effectively with people, because I would either go from one extreme to the other. It was either I would explain and be like, yes, I'll do whatever you want, or I would tell people to go away in not so friendly words, shall we say.
Yes.
And the other thing is like learning mindfulness, which is a skill that we'll probably talk about in other podcasts, but has really allowed me to understand myself and what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling at that particular point in time. And then the other aspect of dialectical behaviour therapy, if I can remember correctly, is distress tolerance. And distress tolerance is when I get overwhelmed with emotion, particularly anger in my particular situation, I would usually have acted out, so that anger would become my behaviour, whereas distress tolerance teaches you ways to deal with that anger. So instead of me getting so angry that I would erupt into this kind of giant volcano, I would be able to tell people what was upsetting me and why I was angry. So that is what they all are. So just to recap, that's distress tolerance. Emotional regulation, so that's how to better regulate your emotions, so I wasn't swinging from being overwhelmingly happy to overwhelmingly I'm going to kill you. Interpersonal effectiveness, so that's being able to say no to people, which I find extremely hard. And mindfulness.
Okay, so let's move on to looking at statistics about specific mental health issues. So for example, in the UK per year, it's estimated that 5.9 people in every 100 have a generalised anxiety disorder, and 3.3 in 100 have depression.
That's more than I would expect, I think, particularly with the anxiety. Although, I don't know, I wonder if the depression might be higher and there's lack of reporting for it. I would have suspected depression to be higher than anxiety. But... yeah,
and that's the thing. I would have thought it would be the other way around. I think maybe if you've got, they've separated out panic disorder here as well, and mixed anxiety and depression.
Maybe that's where I'm thinking.
Because it's saying that if you have a mix of anxiety and depression, then 7.8 people in every 100 have it. So if you add those together and you say generalised anxiety, depression all together, you're talking, about 15-16% of people.
Wow, that's incredible. So it's higher. I think it's higher prevalence than I would have expected.
Yeah. Especially as these statistics must be of reported people. So, on top of that, you've got people that aren't actually getting help or aren't actually going to get, the help they need. I know that in the last few years when I've had anxiety, I haven't gone to the doctors. I haven't, had a diagnosis. So there's going to be a lot of people like that haven't.
But yeah, also the fact that you're not necessarily getting the help that you ask for when you go these days, unfortunately.
Yeah. An interesting one, it's got psychotic disorders are less than one person in every 100, so 0.7 of a person in every 100 in the last year have been diagnosed. But what was interesting to me was that if bipolar and borderline personality disorder both have around 2 people in every 100 that get diagnosed, and antisocial personality disorder, which I'm not sure exactly what that is, has a 3.3 in every 100. Do you know any more about that?
Antisocial personality?
Yeah, it's just it's not something I've heard of. I've heard obviously with the BPD because of yourself, bipolar and psychotic disorders, but I hadn't really looked at that. So maybe something we explore in a future podcast.
I think so.
Yeah,
we'll have to look into it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I know that, a lot of anxiety can make you not want to go out and socialise, not want you to go and be with people and be outside, even though you want to. But yeah, we'll come back to it. Moving on, another statistic, which I think this actually, I thought was really high, that 20.6 people in every 100 have suicidal thoughts.
That is huge, I think, personally.
Yeah. Well, if you divide, if you, being a bit of a mathematician, my A-level maths coming in here, 20 in 100, you're saying 2 in every 10 or 1 in every 5.
That's quite a lot, isn't it, really?
1 in 5 people having suicidal thoughts. I think that's huge. I mean, attempts-wise, they're saying it's a lot lower at 6.7 in every 100.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. And self-harm is 7.3 in every 100. So if you add those, but then if you take those together, you're talking about 14 in every 100, and so... But 20, 1 in 5 just made me really surprised.
It makes me surprised too. But then I guess I have had suicidal thoughts, so maybe it is more common than people would assume.
Yeah. And I know that sometimes, to want help, you kind of sometimes have to hit rock bottom where you feel maybe something like that before you or the people around you get you to have help.
That's true. That's completely true. Just a quick note, all of these statistics, I'm going to put a link in the show notes for you. So if you wanted to find out more about what we've been discussing, just click on the links and it'll take you through to the websites where I found these resources, if you're interested.
Okay.
So I guess coming back to all of this, the prevalence of mental health, I think, is higher than I originally thought. With some of the statistics... not everyone in the country has been surveyed. For some of the surveys, it means that it's been taken from private housing, particularly the UK statistics, and it's not showing things such as people in hospitals, people in prisons, people in sheltered housing, or people who are homeless. So there's a huge majority of people out there that you would expect that may have a higher mental health
Well, they have
problem.
more risk factors of having a mental health illness, don't they? The risk factors of when you are out of work or out of home, or you don't have the support systems around you, you are more susceptible to those mental health issues.
Definitely. So it's just something to note that these figures don't include those kinds of people. So I think finally, coming back onto the stigma associated with mental health, and I discussed previously, briefly, that there is much more, there's much more willingness to speak about mental health these days, I think.
Yeah.
It's becoming less of a closed door thing. It's not like you would send people off to hospital or stuff now without... Yeah,
we're not talking men in white coats with a straight jacket turning up.
Dragging you.
Yeah, and I think the media and television and film have really helped. I mean, things like, if you go onto Netflix now, 13 Reasons is a specific one I can think off the top of my head, but there's also lots of others where, a lot of mental health is dealt with in everyday TV. And I think... some people have criticised that because they think that it gives people ideas, but at the same time, I think that it has meant that people talk about it more.
Definitely. I definitely think that it's better now than it ever has been, but I do think that there's still quite a lot of stigma for certain people out there.
Yeah.
We can certainly see that in discrimination of people who have mental health illnesses. Lots of people have reported that there is a negative impact upon their lives. Certain people find that the stigma and discrimination they experience from society, but they also have it from their families and from their friends and their employers. So I don't know if you've ever come across any stigma.
Definitely. When I had my depression, which was now almost 20 years ago now. No, 10 years ago now. No,
You're adding age
to myself, about 10 years ago now. I went on medication, and my own parents were against it and saying that, I should be able to deal with it on my own. I shouldn't have to resort to things like that, and just sort of like a pick yourself up and get yourself going again. But it was bigger than that, and it was more, and they didn't understand. And now they're, much more supportive about these things, but back then they weren't. And I think a lot of people find that with their own families. Mental health, some people don't realise how bad it is because you don't talk about it, because you don't tell people, because often it does make you feel isolated and you don't want to, necessarily share. So I never felt I could share with my parents fully, so they probably didn't understand how bad I was feeling.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me, I definitely think I've felt some stigma around things. I mean, I needed specific time off work in Australia when I went through my DBT therapy, or they were very supportive. However, there were points when obviously I would have a major breakdown as such, or kind of I would say I was going a bit crazy, but the poor people around me had to deal with that. So before I would hide all of the craziness, but I would be much more open about it just because it was more raw. I think that's difficult for other people to handle. Also, in my family, my grandmother is very, very much against taking medication for anything, including the fact that myself, I take a particular drug for my multiple sclerosis that slows down the progression. I've got a cousin in America who has to take drugs just to help her get through the day. She was dead set when I told her that I was taking antidepressants on me actually taking them at all. However, without them, I don't think I would still be sat here talking to you.
Well, no, I mean, I know that sometimes even on the medication you have days when you don't want to leave the house, you have days when you feel all the anxiety and you don't feel that you want to be part of the society around you at times, know.
Definitely. I mean, people inadvertently hurt me, and if I can not deal and interact with people, they can't hurt me, so I tend to hide, basically.
Yeah, and I don't think that's uncommon. I think, that's what most people who are going through it want to do. Partly because, like you said, you're scared of people hurting you, because you're scared of maybe of being judged by them, of them being saying, you shouldn't be dealing with things like this. You should be dealing with it better. And I think it's that sense of, I know when I had my depression, I felt a sense of failure, that I should be able to deal with everything without this happening to me. But unfortunately it's not like that. And we look after our bodies, but we don't really look after our minds.
Not in the same way, and not to the same level as we do with our physical health. There's also stereotypes out there, particularly that are portrayed by the media. You mentioned it before, but I don't know about you, but mental illness is often portrayed as people are dangerous, unpredictable, and are responsible for their own illness and are generally incompetent, which is really sad when you think about it. So someone who has spent a lot of time trying to better themselves, I would be classified as incompetent, even though I've reached the highest level of education that I could possibly achieve, and that I am constantly trying to better myself and learn new things. And people would find, potentially interacting me, that I would be some kind of risk to their own sense of self-preservation, so we say.
And that's, it's just so not true. You're not like that at all. And yes, you back in the day you had your violent moments, but not towards me. never, and not towards, random people.
That's true.
It was the people that were very, very close to you, your husband. It wasn't strangers in the street and things like that, which I think, the media perception of crazy people going out there and hitting people with, axes and stuff, and it just really doesn't help. Things like the Gone Girl, who, made, the amazing book, and I really enjoyed the read. I thought it was amazing, but the portrayal of her is that she is crazy, in that she has one of these conditions, and she deals with that in a very controlled but also very manipulative way, and I think it wasn't the best portrayal of what mental health could be.
No, definitely not. I mean, for me, the anger was expressed towards my husband, unfortunately, but it was also directed at me, so I would self-harm to get rid of the feeling of that anger. So what you might find is that in reality, quite a lot of people with mental health issues actually are more likely to hurt themselves than they are to hurt others. Not saying that there aren't people out there that have mental health conditions and do these things. It's the fact that they're just so sensationalised when they are reported in the media. You just think that everyone with schizophrenia, for example, can go out and kill people,
and it's the minority, it's not the majority of people. I read another book about someone who so when you're a psychopath, I read a book about this girl, and she said everyone thinks psychopaths go out there killing everyone, but actually most psychopaths are actually around us every day and we don't even realise, and actually act and have learnt to act in a certain way, and to almost pretend they have the feelings they don't have.
Yeah, which I think is kind of sad. It's us making them conform to what society thinks they should be doing. I mean, another thing is that I've also faced not discrimination and stigma associated with mental health services, and even just my GP. Particularly, you heard the statement where I went and said, look, I've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and I was basically told that I was weird and they didn't understand the diagnosis. Some people have reported that psychologists even refuse to treat people with borderline personality disorder because we can be quite manipulative, because we have this internal fear that everyone is going to abandon us, and that would include the psychologist. So we have this knack of being able to manipulate the situation to push someone away from us, so we can hone in on like your smallest, your insecurities, like your hidden insecurities that you might not be sharing with everyone, but we can get in there and we can stick the knife in, so to speak, to get you to think about it, and it starts to, it's quite interesting how we can manage to get into that. But I mean, as a result of that, this discrimination can become internalised. I mean, as I start to think about it, if lots of people continue to tell me that I'm not able to recover from this, that I don't deserve to be looked after, I can be dangerous, and I'm not responsible for my own illness, I'm going to keep believing that, and I'm not going to get the help that I need. And then I feel shame, I have low self-esteem as a result, and I feel like I can't do anything that I want to do.
So actually the stigma is perpetuating the illness itself.
Pretty much.
And making it worse. And I think even making things worse in the way that if you tell somebody that you're dangerous all the time, they're going to believe it, and then they're going to act out in a way that they shouldn't. If you tell someone that this illness has taken control of them, then they're going to feel less responsibility for their actions.
Definitely. I also think that some people may shy away of going to get a mental illness diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis because of this. Like, they would hide it from people and be like, no, I don't have a problem. But is it really a good thing to be hiding something that could be so detrimental to your own health?
Well, no, if I think of where you were before you got treatment and to the point where you are now, you're much... not you are
I'm
happier.
more stable.
Yeah, you are more stable, but you are happier with your life and yourself. And things aren't perfect, but you are on the path to I can see a much better and a much brighter future. If you carried on the way that you were, God forbid what would have happened. I think it would have been really bad.
Definitely. But I guess the kind of final point that I'd like to kind of come towards is that these days, is talking about mental health really enough? Particularly when we aren't able to access the care that we need. So I was offered, when I got back, talk therapy but via the telephone, so on the phone counselling, which wouldn't ever be enough. So I currently go to and do something called Stigma therapy, which is a type of therapy that you probably wouldn't be able to do on the phone, but I need it because it starts to get me. It's a bit like cognitive behaviour therapy but different, so it challenges my beliefs and assumptions, whereas cognitive behaviour therapy, I felt like I was constantly being attacked by the person doing the therapy. This is a bit more genteel, so to speak, but I mean, as a result of not being able to access the care that I required on the NHS, I have to go private. I've been seeing my psychologist now for nearly 2 years. It's long term. It's
once a week.
Every week.
Yeah.
And I pay for that. And at the moment, I think I'm paying £95, but it originally was £115 every week to just get the support that I needed because it wasn't available to me. This isn't the only case. I mean, there's more people out there. I was reading a blog by Emily Reynolds, and she is a mental health advocate. She's also written a book, so I shall put a link in the show notes for you to have a look, and we might even have a look at a book at some point. But she went to her GP to get some medication. She suffers from bipolar disorder, and she also has anxiety issues. She went to the doctors, asked for medication, and they basically denied her.
Did they say why?
Not that I could see within the blog post that she posted, but they basically turned around and told her no, she couldn't have the medication.
It's awful, especially as, these medications, it is about, they're helping to control the chemicals in your brain. It isn't, I think we think of mental health as completely unphysical, but actually it is about the composition of our brains and how our brains work and the chemical levels of different, the levels of different chemicals in our brains. So without these medications, people, are going to have these imbalances, and those are the things that are going to cause the things that the stigma says about. They're going to be, erratic and things like that, which is just what we don't want, really.
Exactly. So really what we're trying to do with this podcast is, again, add another voice to campaigning against stigma of mental health. We also would like to mention to you that perhaps, as I said, just talking about it isn't enough anymore. You can get more actively involved, and I'd like to put out a call to action. We are not in any way supported by any sponsors at the moment, but Mind, the mental health charity, you can sign up to be a mental health campaigner, so you can get involved with their campaigns and lobby your MP to improve the provision of mental health services within the UK. And I'm going to put another link to that particular website at the show notes. I think that now nicely leads us into what we're going to do with this podcast. So, Becky, what are we going to do?
So, we're going to release a podcast hopefully every 2 weeks. That's what we're planning on doing. And that podcast will discuss a book that discusses mental health. That could be a fictional book that's a story about a character that has a mental health illness, or we have some biographical novels as well, which we're going to read and discuss. And then
I will also do a podcast dedicated to a particular mental health issue. So, for example, if we read a book about borderline personality disorder, I will do a separate podcast that gives you more information about that particular illness. Also, another example, we've got a book about schizophrenia. I will then also do a podcast about schizophrenia, just so that you guys know what we're talking about and where we're coming from.
Yeah, so, and we might even, we want to try and get some of the authors involved to see whether we can interview them about the way that they presented things, and really just explore mental health and the many different conditions there are and the different people that are involved in it.
Definitely. So if you are an author and you would like us to read your book and talk about it on this podcast, and even be interviewed by us, if that is something that you are able to do, give us an email at hello@mentalhealthbookclub.com, which will come straight through to us. Also, if you've got any book suggestions, let us know. We will be very happy to get your suggestions. Also, if you want to talk to us and let us know what you think about the podcast, or you have any questions, or you have read the books yourselves and you disagree with us or you agree with what we say, let us know. And we have a Facebook and Twitter.
So Facebook is Mental Health Book Club, and we also have a website which you can find a link to all of this stuff as well, and you can contact us, and that is mentalhealthbookclub.com.
So the first book we're going to read and discuss with you guys, I think, will be Anxiety Girl by Lacey London. So if you would like to read along with us, you have the next 2 weeks to read the book. We will also have a link from our website so that you can purchase the book. It's a Kindle-only book, and we will see you soon. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the Mental Health Book Club podcast. We will discuss new books every 2 weeks, and in between we will have special deep dive episodes specifically to do with a mental health illness. You can find out more about us at thementalhealthbookclub.com.